Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of cryptids horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story. My uncle killed someone when he was younger. As you can guess, this isn't my story. It was told to me through sips of whiskey and packed cigars. I can't vouch for the exact details, but I'll try to tell the story as it was told to me. My uncle grew up in the 60s and 70s in a house full of kids, and with a friend group consisting of stoners and underage drinkers. He was close with almost all of them except for a guy we'll call Dan. My uncle and Dan never got along well. Apparently, Dan had dated my aunt and broken her heart. One day, the group went camping in the old woods across town. The trek was arduous. There were lots of fallen trees, low-hanging branches to duck under, and a narrow river they needed to find a way around. My uncle was the one leading them to their campsite, an out-of-place clearing that almost looked purposeful. When retelling this story, he said they had been complaining all the way there, but became practically awestruck at the sight. The clearing was more of a meadow. Beautiful flowers and tall, luscious trees formed a large ring around them as they unloaded their packs. It took them until dusk to fully set up their camp for the next 3 days. The group huddled around a campfire as night fell, telling stories and reminiscing about childhood long into the night. Someone had snuck some whiskey into their pack and was passing it around to everyone. There was when my uncle heard the tale about a cave nearby. The story talks about a group of kids who went hiking in the mountains, only for one of them to return. Shell-shocked and traumatized, the kid was never able to tell the police exactly where to find his two friends. A hush fell over the group, and unease spread. Something about that story unsettled even my uncle, a known skeptic. The group called an early night and turned in for restless sleep. My uncle had a dream that night. In his dream, he was the young child from the story. He was trekking up a steep incline, followed by two of his friends, Susan and Fred. It had just rained, and the mud was slippery under their boots. He looked back at the two following his lead and said something inaudible as a flash of lightning crashed nearby. Soon, booming thunder shook the very ground they walked on. The three marched onward as dark clouds loomed overhead, threatening to unleash a mighty downpour. After what felt like hours of walking in place, the earth leveled out as they reached a small clearing. The three children stood facing the mouth of a cave, and when they peeked inside, a sharp drop-off beckoned them closer. Susan grabbed my uncle by the arm, but her voice was drowned as another flash of lightning was followed by more roaring thunder. The darkness urged my uncle ever closer. Arm-like tendrils reached for him out of the darkness as he took another step toward the cliff edge. He could hear whispers from the pit. The voices yearned incessantly for a sacrifice. My uncle awoke from his nightmare with sweat rolling down his back and labored breathing. The sun had yet to rise, and all that was heard was the gentle snoring from his friends in the neighboring tents. Deciding he needed a breather, my uncle crawled out of his tent and into the warm night air, admiring the stars that were clearer and brighter than he'd ever seen. Like tiny, faraway flashlights in the sky. "Beautiful, aren't they?" said a soft voice beside him, snapping him from his thoughts as he turned to face Susan. "I've never seen the stars this bright." "Yeah, they're really something else." He smiled at Susan. "What did you think of that story?" she said abruptly, turning to my uncle with a curious gaze. "The one about the kids?" he asked. He had almost forgotten the story and the dream that followed. "Dan always has good stories, doesn't he?" "I guess." He paused before recalling his strange dream. "I had a nightmare." A look of wonder dawned on Susan's face. "You too?" Her attention was no longer on the stars. My uncle looked at her questioningly. "Are you messing with me?" "What?" "No, I had a nightmare, too. I woke up in a cold sweat and everything." Susan put her hands up defensively. Just then, Dan stepped out of his tent, his hair disheveled from sleep. The two stared at him as he rubbed his eyes. "You two are loud talkers, you know," he spoke with a yawn. "I think you're just a light sleeper," Susan said, rolling her eyes. Dan shrugged and sat in one of the fold-up chairs surrounding the now burnt-out campfire. He looked up at the stars. "Man, would you look at that?" he smiled. I was just saying the same thing, my uncle said, sitting beside Dan. Susan stayed standing but looked up at the stars, too. The three stayed like that for a few minutes, enjoying the cold breeze that the night brought. Susan placed an arm on Dan's shoulder and yawned. That story gave us nightmares, she smiled down at him. Dan seemed proud of himself and looked over at my uncle. You too, Thomas? My uncle only nodded, breaking his gaze from the stars to look at his feet. Yeah, it was strange, he said. We were walking up the trail to that cave, Susan, me, and Fred. I had that same dream. Susan cut in. I was leading Thomas and Fred to some dark cave, and every time I tried to speak, thunder would drown out my voice, she explained her dream to them. My uncle's blood ran cold as he heard Susan explain the exact dream he had. It was the same, except he had led the two. My uncle looked back at the tents, at Fred's tent that he shared with his girlfriend, Amy. He could still hear Fred's gentle snoring. The boy was fast asleep, oblivious to everything. Hey, what if we went to that cave?
Dan interjected.
Susan and my uncle stared at him as if he were crazy. Dan only laughed as he urged the two to consider it at least. I know where it is. We could go there in the morning. With a mischievous smile, he said, or we could go right now. My uncle swallowed and bounced his leg, not wanting to chicken out. He wanted to impress Susan. He'd had feelings for her all summer. Her auburn hair and light freckles that danced across her caramel skin. Her brown eyes with hints of gold always looked at him with humor whenever she would prompt adventure. It was her idea to go camping. Let's go right now, before the others wake up, Susan agreed, and the two looked at my uncle expectantly. All right, fine. Let's be quick, though. He gave in and stood up. Susan passed Dan a lantern, and the three headed away from camp. The lantern and the moon gave them just enough light to see where they placed their feet as they hiked up what was slowly becoming a mountain to where Dan said the cave was. It was dark, but by the time they had reached a small clearing on the steep hill, the sun had begun to rise behind them. Is it here? Asked Susan, not nearly out of breath as the other two. Should be, answered Dan, raising the lantern as he spun around, surveying their surroundings. My uncle groaned in exhaustion. Are you sure it's even real? I'm positive, Dan called back to him. The three looked around the small clearing before Dan called my uncle and Susan over to him. I found it, he said triumphantly. As the two walked over to him, all they could see was foliage, but as Dan pushed back the leaves, they laid their eyes on the mouth of a dark cave. The entrance was only a couple of feet tall and extremely narrow, yet as the three peered inside, they could see it opened up into a vast cavern. Should we, I don't know, go inside? Dan asked cautiously. A gust of hot air was continuously coming from the cavern. The other two were silent as they shared glances of unease. My uncle was the first to respond, wanting to impress Susan with his bravery. Let's go inside, he spoke, looking at Susan expectantly. I'm sure it's fine. Sighing, Susan agreed, and soon the three of them ducked into the cave. Upon entering, the three were hit by a wall of foul-smelling, hot air. The inside of the cave was dark and seemed to swallow any light provided by the lantern. The three expected to see bats come flying out as they entered, like in the cartoons. Instead, all they saw was empty darkness. They dared not move as they surveyed the cavern. Only then did they see they were standing on the edge of a steep drop-off. Whoa, Susan remarked, staring at the pit. Wouldn't want to fall down there, Dan joked, trying to make light of the situation. My uncle said nothing. He was practically transfixed by the inky darkness that threatened to spill over onto the edge he stood on. It smells awful here, Dan spoke nasally as he pinched his nose. Yeah, did something die? Susan followed Dan's action. It's the pit, my uncle said finally. It's from my nightmare. Susan and Dan stared at my uncle as he stepped toward the darkness. They wanted to say something, grab him, and pull him back. Back and out of this cave. They felt they never should have entered. As Dan reached to pull him back, he caught a glimpse at exactly what my uncle was surrendering himself to. A monstrous thing of nightmares. Whether it was an animal or a being of divine creation, my uncle was not sure. But it called to him. It spoke to him incoherently, in a language long forgotten by time. It yearned for a feast, It yearned for him. My uncle internally screamed, but his body had long since abandoned him. He was a prisoner in his mind with a body that betrayed his every command. Thomas. Dan yanked my uncle by the arm back towards the cave entrance.
No.
The pit, the darkness. He shouted as he fought against Dan's attempt at a rescue. Tendrils of darkness pulled him closer to the pit. They were stronger than the two of them. Yet, in one last attempt to gain control over his body, my uncle decided the pit needed to be fed, or else it would not let the three go. "I'm sorry, Dan," he shouted over the voices from the pit and pulled Dan closer, yanking him to the edge before finally shoving the boy into the pit. As if like a switch, the voices stopped. The tendrils receded, and all that was left were my uncle and Susan. He looked around the cave and picked up the lantern, searching for Susan as he realized she was no longer in the cavern. "Susan?" He called out for her. He exited the cave's darkness and saw Susan huddled against a tree, staring at the mouth expectantly. The two said nothing to each other as they trekked down the mountain, sharing only glances and a silent agreement that what happened back there would never be spoken of. At least, that was until now. As I said, I cannot vouch for the events of this story. My uncle is an old, couch-hopping drunk who, although I love him, isn't known to be the most coherent man. I hope you all enjoyed this story. I know my uncle has many more that I may transcribe in the future. Second story. My grandfather was a survivor of a horrendous medical experiment at Auschwitz. My grandfather sat in his rocking chair, holding his body rigid like that of a corpse. His eyes looked like those of an old dog. His lips constantly chattered, and his fingers trembled with the Parkinson's that was eating him away like a cancer. We both knew he didn't have long left. He looked at me with his strange, yellow eyes and gave a weak grin. "Elias, I think I should tell you the story of my childhood," my grandfather said, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "I will tell you of what happened to me when I was only 13 years old, when I was sent to Auschwitz with my father by my side." This is the story he told me, unbelievable as it is. Though my grandfather has been dead for years now, his story still stays with me to this day as an unbearable burden on my heart. I still remember the moment we arrived at the camp like it was yesterday. We were exhausted and starving. We had been on the cold cattle cars for 5 days and 5 nights, and we were given no food or water that entire time. Many of the sick and old died on the way. We moved their corpses to the corner of the car, and my father said Kaddish over their corpses. It was the first time I saw the light of life extinguished from the eyes of so many in so short a time, but it would be far from the last. Finally, long after the night had come, the doors to our cattle cars slid open. Pale, starving creatures in striped black and white rags stood around SS soldiers in black, spotless uniforms. They grinned as the death's head insignia and sharp lightning bolt runes gleamed bright silver. The SS men all had vicious German shepherds who lunged at the frightened prisoners, gnashing and snapping at the air. I saw more than a few people get bit by the vicious dogs. They had deep bite wounds and chunks torn out of their flesh, and we all learned to avoid the dogs and the SS men as much as possible after that. In the dark night, we were formed into lines. Old women held the hands of their small grandchildren, and sons tried to stay with their fathers. We moved forward. Up ahead, I saw a man in a black SS uniform whistling a tune from Wagner. I would later realize that this man was Dr. Mengele. I tried to stay with my father, but the surging crowds pulled us apart. I didn't know it at that moment, but I would never see my father again. If I had known, would I have acted differently? Would I have told him how much I loved him? I'll never know, but his ashes rose up into the air later that night, and I saw it from the freezing barracks in that place of shadows. Someone behind me whispered in my ear, "Boy, how old are you?" 13, I said, turning to look at the strange figure, a starving man in a striped uniform. The man shook his head. "No, you're 16. When you get up there, remember that. You're not 13, you're 16, the man insisted. He was part of the prison commando that helped the SS with translating the many languages that streamed into the camp, and also helped them organize the prisoners for slave labor or death. I would never see that starving man again, but I followed his advice. As I got up to Dr. Mengele, he stopped whistling for just a couple seconds. The black, cloudless sky hung heavy above us, the clouds of smoke rising up from the crematoria with the smell of burning hair and searing flesh. Dr. Minjal gave me a fatherly smile, but in his eyes, there was something as cold as frozen steel, hiding just under the surface. I could see it. I could feel it in the air. I could almost smell it radiating off of his skin. It sent ice water racing through my veins. "Hello, son," he said in a warm voice as he gave a faint smile, though his eyes didn't smile, and as I think back on it, neither did his mouth. "What's your age?" 16, I said confidently, looking him straight in the eye. "Any physical deformities? Any illness?" he asked, the faint half-smile like a statue of Buddha still plastered across his lips. I shook my head. "No, sir," I said. He nodded and pointed to the right. I didn't know if this was a good thing or a bad thing. I saw, to my growing horror, that most of the prisoners were going to the left, including all the elderly, all the children, anyone with disabilities, and anyone who looked too frail or emaciated. In all, about 90% of the line went to the left, and about 10% went to the right. Those who went to the left wouldn't live out the hour. They would be stripped naked, beaten, and bludgeoned to force as many people into the gas chamber as possible. Then the heavy metal door would be sealed. The Zyklon B pellets would be dropped into a vat of sulfuric acid, and the vents would turn on, whirring like hornets, breathing their deadly poison into the concrete tomb. The screams in the chamber often went on for over 20 minutes. The corpses would be intertwined in pyramids, their arms and legs caught together like rats in a rat king. The cyanide gas prevented their lips and fingernails from turning blue, and made the corpses look pink, almost healthy, except for their frozen, terrified death masks and sightless eyes. In 1944, while I was at Auschwitz-Birkenau, I was coming back late from a work detail in the nearby concrete factory with some other inmates. We passed through the freezing winds and whipping snow that bit like an ice pick into our bodies. There were open-air pits that belched black smoke into the air constantly. What a world we lived in, where the graveyards rose into the sky and the blackness of space descended on those below. That was the night when my faith in God finally died forever. As I would learn later, the SS had a recent shortage of Zyklon B, the cyanide pellets used to exterminate masses of human beings and turn them into ashes and fetid, reeking smoke. The advances of the Red Army had caused issues with delivering it, and a transport of children had just come into the camp. The SS men and the capos loaded these children, most of whom were no older than 7 or 8, onto the beds of 2 dump trucks, beating them with truncheons and kicking and punching them. When the crying, bloody children were finally all settled in on the back of the dump trucks, they had drivers back them up towards the inferno of burning bodies. I watched, horrified, as they slowly angled the beds downwards. The children began sliding out with horrible, wretched screams. They fell into the pit of fire. I watched their hair burn, their skin blacken and sizzle, the drops of fat melt and drip off their shrieking lips. Some of them tried to crawl out, but the black-clad SS men went around with long sticks and pushed the half-dead, writhing children back into the scorching flames. My grandson, I tell you truthfully that this is what I saw with my own eyes, heard with my own ears, when I was only 13 years old. The screams of the burning children went on for 15 or 20 minutes. It felt like, at that moment, we stood in the center of the universe. God had died. He had murdered eternity and left us alone in this endless pit of suffering and death. There was no justice, I knew, and if God was real at all, then he was either evil or insane. The faraway stars of cold white light seemed to turn and look down on us, all of us, the living and the dead alike. The wind whipped past us, screaming with the voices of the damned. Sometimes, late at night, I think I still hear those children screaming as their bodies burned and blackened. Is it any wonder, then, that I almost never sleep, and when I do, I wake up shrieking as mountains of pale, burning corpses flash across my mind? One day, during selection, I saw Dr. Minjal again. He looked me up and down and wrote something on a clipboard. Later that day, I was told by the capo that I would be moved to the medical ward. The medical ward? I asked, confused. Why? I'm not sick. The doctor requests your presence, the capo said sarcastically, giving me a little bow. He was a fat man with a face like a bulldog and red hands like a butcher. He loved to beat and rob the prisoners under him. Move, scum. Double time. Get your ass to the medical barracks. I didn't need to be told twice. I quickly scurried away, constantly glancing back to make sure no blows from his fat hands would rain down on my head. I wound my way through the bare, wooden barracks that acted as our homes, the homes for walking skeletons of men whose bodies were frozen and dying. Within these barracks, we were often packed so tightly together on the hard, wooden planks that one man couldn't turn around in the night without every other man in the row having to move. But when the freezing winter cold blew in and we only had thin blankets and our black and white striped rags, the body heat from the others kept us from freezing to death, at least some of the time. Corpses were taken out of the barracks every morning. Prisoners who died from the cold, from hunger, from dysentery or disease, from beatings and murders and suicides. It was like a constant stream of death, a waterfall of oblivion crashing forward. The corpses came, but the fire ate them all greedily and exhaled only fetid black smoke in response. I walked into the medical barracks, sat on a chair, waiting. I saw my friend from the work commando, Moshe. His dark, serious eyes stared through me, as if he didn't see me. He had a straight nose and high cheekbones on his aristocratic face, though he now looked as pale and starved as I did myself. No more than a bag of bones wrapped in skin and clad in rags. "Eliezer," Moshe said, suddenly realizing I was there. "Were you chosen for this too?" I nodded grimly, not knowing what he was referring to, but feeling in my heart it was nothing good. Nothing good ever came from this camp, after all. Nothing but reeking smoke and ashes came from it. Nothing but the hurricane of souls whipped away in the currents of the Zyklon became from it. "Do you know why we are here?" I asked, fidgeting and nervous. I glanced around, seeing a clean, well-stocked medical room beyond with a surgical table in the middle. There were bunks in the back of the medical barracks where the lucky ones would live. We even got increased rations of sawdust bread and watery soup. "Dr. Minjal wants us," Moshe said simply, and his eyes looked through me again. His mind seemed to drift off, far away from this world of suffering. My emaciated body was such a heavy thing. It felt like the weight of the entire universe was contained within that body. I despised that body, that starving, sickly thing that followed me like a shadow. I wanted to be free of it, to see the highest reality without a body, to see truth without this constant suffering and agony, the constant hunger and cold and beatings and the stench of death. But it wasn't to be. Dr. Minjal walked into the barracks a few minutes later, surrounded by female nurses clad in white. He looked at me and Moshe. His cold blue eyes sparkled with intelligence. He always kept his black SS uniform perfectly cleaned and ironed. It gave an impression that some black knight from a lost tale of the Dark Ages had just wandered in. He held a clipboard in his hand. He glanced down at it, frowning. Then he spoke in clipped German. "A. 9971 and A. 8991. You are hereby required to participate in a medical experiment that will test the effects of certain drugs on the body. We do this under the authority of the Greater German Reich and our Reichsfuhrer SS Himmler. You will stay here in the medical barracks until the experiment has ended," Dr. Minjal said. As soon as he was done, he walked briskly over to the dark room with the surgical table. He came back out with 2 syringes filled with some black fluid that shone with glittering rainbows. He came up to me first. "Hey, 9971, your arm," Dr. Minjal demanded. I stretched out my arm. He applied a tourniquet. When the vein throbbed like a fat worm, he plunged the needle inside and pressed down on the plunger. I felt something like lava ripping its way through my body as my breath caught in my throat. I thought I was choking and dying. My heart beat so fast in my chest that I feared it must explode. Dr. Minjal walked over to Moshe as my vision turned white. I groaned, my teeth chattering, and then I fell forward onto the wooden floor. I must have lost consciousness, because when I awoke, it was night in the medical barracks. I found myself laying on a bunk. A small serving of sawdust bread and thin, watery soup was laid down next to me. Still sleeping, I saw the form of Moshe, his face as pale as a skull. "Moshe?" I whispered, trying to push myself to my feet. My head throbbed. I looked down at my arm, seeing a spreading patch of blackened necrotic tissue spreading from the injection site. It almost looked like shiny scales were spreading across my skin. I looked down at Moshe's arm and saw the same dark patches there. Wake up, Moshe, please. I need you. I need someone. I can't do this alone. But in my heart, I knew that we were all born alone and we all died alone. Moshe couldn't help me with anything. Even God couldn't help me here. He didn't listen to our prayers or hear the Kaddish read for the dead. He had turned his face away from us, and every dying heart there felt that great emptiness as the life was extinguished from their eyes. I shook Moshe gently, not wanting to scare him. His eyes flew open. He looked up at me, and I saw with horror that something was wrong. His eyes had become slitted and yellow, like the eyes of a serpent. He hissed at me. A thin stream of frothy blood bubbled from his throat as he gurgled, pushing himself up like a zombie. What's happened to you? I asked in panic, backpedaling away from the transformed Moshe. He looked like a rabid animal, his eyes gleaming with insanity. He came at me, and his teeth looked longer, sharper, more predatory. They looked like fangs. He leapt off the bunk, soaring through the air towards me. As he gnashed his teeth, I frantically tried to push him away. His jaw snapped together with a crack like a bullwhip. He lunged forward, and his bleached white face came down. I felt the skin on my face tear with a pain like fire spreading through my head. He bit down on my cheek and ripped upwards, leaving a mutilated flap of skin hanging there. I felt something hot and poisonous coursing through my bloodstream, but unlike Moshe, I had not gone insane. I felt my teeth lengthening, though, and my eyes abruptly adjusted to the dark. I could see every mote of dust floating through the air, see every spatter of my blood on the swept wooden floors. A hiss tore its way out of my throat. My arm lunged forward, as if with a mind of its own. Sharp claws ripped their way out of the ends of my fingers as I threw Moshe off of me. He ran out into the night, hissing and wailing, his forked tongue flicking out between his bloody lips. A few moments later, I heard SS men yelling at the nearby perimeter, and then guns started firing. The banshee wail from Moshe grew louder, and the SS men screamed, their voices filled with panic and terror. I staggered out of the medical barracks, seeing Moshe clawing and biting at the black-clad form of an SS man. Two others lay dead next to him, their throats torn out, the mutilated flesh sliced wide open. Moshe leapt off of the dying SS man and loped towards the electrified fence. In horror and astonishment, I watched him swipe at it with his claws. It gave a loud pop of electricity, and I saw a flash of blue light. But the black scales that now covered almost all of Moshe's skin only seemed to glow brighter, gleaming like obsidian. Moshe remained unaffected. He ripped a hole in the fence as it continued sizzling, leapt over the razor wire, and disappeared into the dark forests of Poland beyond. After a long moment staring at the bodies of the SS men, I ran forwards toward freedom as well, following the trail of Moshe. I still had my mind, however. Whatever poison Dr. Minjal had given us hadn't affected me like it had affected Moshe. But still, I noticed I was healing faster. The deep gash on my cheek stopped bleeding within minutes, and a layer of thin, black scales started to cover the wound. Over the next few weeks, I made my way to Switzerland, where I spent the rest of the war. But I heard rumors in the forests of Poland that there was a strange creature attacking isolated farms and houses. A creature with slitted eyes like a serpent's and black scales covering his deformed, twisted body. My grandfather stopped speaking suddenly, looking up at me with glazed eyes. "Do you believe it, Elias?" he asked. "Do you believe what I've told you?" I nodded. He pulled up his sleeves, and there, on his arms, I saw black scales covering his skin all the way to the wrists. Third story. My encounter with the Goatman. My friends and I were out camping in Maryland near a river. We set up a whole weekend where we would go tubing, which meant we would get in these giant inflatable tires and float down the river. We got there on Friday, go tubing on Saturday, and leave on Sunday. It was me, my girlfriend, her best friend, and her boyfriend. The four of us were supposed to have a great weekend together that instead turned into a nightmare that will keep me away from the outdoors for good. I'm pretty sure I had an encounter with the Goatman. We arrived on Friday with no fuss. We set up our tents at the designated campground and made dinner. There were no other campers around us since school had started up again, so we had the area to ourselves. We drank all night, the other three drinking more than me because I'm not a fan of the hard stuff, just a few beers. It was late at night, probably around midnight when I had to pee, so I left the campsite and walked down the path a little bit into the woods. When I found a good spot, I unzipped my pants and began to relieve myself when I looked ahead and faintly in the moonlight, I could see a figure moving in between the trees. The moon was about half full, so there wasn't much light to make out the features. The leaves and sticks crunched underneath it. Just as I was finishing up, this thing started to make this weird noise. Sounded like a muffled goat sound, but not quite right. Like a person was imitating a goat. It kept walking around like it was looking for something, but whatever it was scared the hell out of me. So I ran back to the campsite and acted like it didn't happen. My friends were so drunk, I don't know how they would have reacted. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else, so I made breakfast. At around noon, we drove up the river about 3 miles using the camp's van service that would drop us off, and we would tube down the river back to our campsite. I had pretty much forgotten about the weird encounter from the previous night until I had a weird feeling of being watched while floating down the river. It was all woods on both sides of the river, so I couldn't really confirm my feeling, but it ruined my whole experience while going down the river. It creeped the hell out of me. My friends started to feel it too when I told them. The other boyfriend claims he saw someone on the riverbank, but no one else saw it. Once we got back to camp, I told them what I saw Friday night, and it really creeped them out. That's when the boyfriend said the thing he saw kind of looked like a weirdly shaped man from a distance. We were all scared and decided that we'd leave first thing in the morning for checkout when the park rangers returned. After a while, we began drinking again and pretty much forgot about our fears and for a moment had fun again. It wasn't until later that night that my fear returned. We were all pretty drunk at this point, and we were doing that thing when you're drunk you kind of have those heart-to-hearts with each other and talk about life. That kind of conversation, you know? We started to hear those noises again. It started off in the distance at first, then got closer and closer to our campsite. We heard noises all around us, just twigs breaking, scratching on trees, and more of those goat noises mixed with a man growling. None of us had a weapon, so we were pretty scared and huddled close to each other. The scariest part was that the bugs stopped making noises. Eventually, we all drank some more and fell asleep around the campfire. I woke up in the middle of the night, probably because I sensed something was wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like sleep paralysis, or something where I couldn't move and couldn't speak. I opened my eyes and saw this terrifying thing in between all of us. It had the body of a skinny man with a distorted face and long, unnatural arms. I saw that it was pacing back and forth between us, would stop and look at my girlfriend and arch its back and act like it was chuckling. It kept twitching its body and sniffing the air around everyone. The Goatman finally came over to me and looked me in the eyes. It had these dark, pitted eyes and its mouth was wet with drool. It got close to me and opened its mouth, making that noise into my face. The noise must have woken the boyfriend, and he started to scream, which scared the creature, and he ran off on all fours back into the woods. I was finally able to move, and I crawled over to my girlfriend and held her the rest of the night. First thing in the morning, we packed our stuff and checked out at the main lodge. We will never go back to those woods in Maryland again. There is something living out there, guys, and I'm telling you this story because I don't want anything to happen to you. Fourth story. We caught a mermaid. When they pulled up the net, men shouting, salt stinging water splashing in our eyes, and the sharp zipping of the rope from the pulley, we saw her. Dewy gray skin, flesh folding through the gaps in the net, long matted hair tangled in the fish piled up around her. We caught a mermaid. To put this in perspective, I was roped into this. My name is Anthony. I am a broke college student grasping at straws for extra work when my part-time job can't be bothered to call me in. I met a guy at a party who knew a guy, and suddenly I was out doing what I thought was commercial fishing. I did think it was odd how easy I was accepted into the crew, but I just assumed that family businesses and the like were trustworthy. They needed extra hands, and I've heard it's hard work I'm willing to do. Flash forward a couple days of running around doing whatever people screamed at me to do. I found out the movies about the ocean weren't exaggerating about the unpredictable weather. I doubt I'll ever be dry again in my life. When we pulled up that net, I thought would be just another full of fish gaping with empty eyes. I saw her and froze, expecting everyone else to do the same. But instead of shock, the men cheered and came forward with more rope, thicker and rougher than that I had seen anywhere on deck. The mermaid screeched a terrible piercing noise I felt in my chest. The chaos became a blur, and as I was pushed to the side, I slowly began to realize that I wasn't hired on to help catch fish. When the night settled, I was told to stay up and watch the creature. I was given a handgun that fit oddly in my hands and told to aim for the head if anything happened. And goddamn it, boy, if you even think about putting a hole through a single scale on that fin, I'll kill you myself. The captain, I think his name was Vance, uttered lowly, face close to mine. With each word I could smell the tobacco he had been chewing for too long in his mouth. The cracks of dryness crawling from his lips up towards his nose gave him a sinister, sickly look as he glared up at me. Right, of course, sir, clumsily I answered, as intimidated as I'm sure the man had planned. I sighed when he turned and finally went below, relaxing a little. The mermaid was still trapped in the net hours later. The men had placed her in a large wooden basin full of ocean water, just big enough so her tail wouldn't hang over the side. The mermaid was large, bigger than any woman I had seen, her skin round and sagging, folding over itself in her cramped prison. She hissed like a snake and thick bile filtered through the rows of jagged teeth in her mouth. This was a monster. I mulled about that thought while I watched the waves fold over again and again, listening to the heavy breathing of the creature behind me when it spoke. I've heard of men. The mermaid's voice was low but feminine, raspy and unused. I stayed facing away from her, just a couple feet from its basin, terrified to turn and look. Hear me? I've heard of your kind, she continued. I've heard what you do for things you value, things like my scales. I coughed and glanced in her direction. The mermaid was reaching towards a shell that rested on the dull wood of the deck, almost close enough to reach. My sisters have seen of your greed and never returned. My mother swallows your gold in return. She chews on your kind that come to her. Her claws dug into the deck and snapped when she pulled at the iron nails. Her blood was red. Your mother? I turned finally, watching her heave in pain as she reached for that small white shell. The ocean. I coughed again. That can't be right. You're obviously a mammal. The ocean isn't alive. The mermaid looked up at me, not caring that I was watching her in her task. The ocean is creation. My mother is all that is left of true darkness in the world of men. Mankind does not like a darkness he cannot manipulate. She created us knowing this. Her eyes were gray. They looked as dead as any fish we had caught on that trip, but they had a sharpness to them. I knew she could see me. I faced away from her again. If you say so. A few minutes passed and I could feel the itch rise in my throat, the one that had been crawling back to me every time I coughed it out when she spoke again. I hear them, my sisters. They are here to crush your boat. The mermaid raised her voice in excitement, and my panic spiked, taking the place of my cough in my throat. Clutching the gun in my hands, I prepared to lift it towards something, anything, as I ran to the side of the boat. I wish I could say I saw 10, or maybe 20 of the same kind of creatures as she, but unfortunately I saw nothing but a shaky reflection of myself. The quick snapping of rope and a great heavy splash sounded behind me and I faltered. I knew she was gone, her and that shell she had been reaching for. And boy, was I afraid to hear about it in the morning. I'm telling you this so I can stay sane. I have never seen the men I met on that boat again. Everyone I tell doesn't believe me, or thinks I'm telling a wild tale. I learned on that day that the ocean is alive. I'm hoping one day that we as humanity will stop hurting it, or it might just swallow us in return. Fifth story. I met Goatman in the woods last night. I love hiking. I love walking into the trees, getting further and further from civilization. The sounds of industry grow dimmer and dimmer. The sounds of nature take over. But that was before last night. Before last night, I thought I knew what was in the forest. I was sure that the most dangerous thing was a hungry bear or a twisted ankle miles from help. I may have been a fragile female, as my father liked to claim, but I was tough. I had more than enough knowledge and experience of basic survival. But meeting monsters, meeting Goatman, I expected none of that when I waltzed into the woods for what I figured was a routine overnight trip. I'd done it many times before, rolled into the parking lot of the Appalachian Trail at 8 a.m., armed with a small tent and the backpack it was attached to. My backpack was packed with food, water, a flashlight, a change of clothes, a first aid kit, a lighter. I was prepared. I thought I was prepared. It's always after I've gotten out of my Subaru and moved to the hatchback of it that I take in any others in the lot. A couple and their dog were making their way into the forest. Another car was already locked and left, and a pair of men, big guys wearing camo. They were hanging out by the tailgate of a truck, beers in hand. I turned away as one of them seemed to notice me looking. I could feel their eyes on me, though I ignored it. I glanced at them only briefly. They had fishing poles. Why do you need camouflage for fishing? I had thought to myself. I was focused on getting my gear out, so I didn't notice at first when one of them walked closer. His foot finally landed on a branch, that telltale crunch alerting me to his presence. He reeked, a mixture of cheap beer, sweat, and grease. He was smiling a gap-toothed grin. His beard was ragged. When he spoke, the stench grew. Better be careful out there, darling. These woods get dark at night. His eyes trailed over me. I puked a little in my mouth. Thanks, I forced a grin. But I think I'll be fine. I finished putting my backpack on with a pointed clip of the chest strap. He grinned wider, though he took the hint and stepped back. I closed the hatch and moved past him, not bothering to fake politeness any longer, keeping my eyes ahead of me. I pressed lock on my key fob and dropped the keys into one of my cargo pants pockets. The man and his friend were chuckling as I made my way across the bridge toward where the trailhead split. The sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I felt watched long after I turned the corner out of sight, following the creek down into the valley between the mountains. I should have left, shouldn't have ignored the way my instincts were screaming. Fortunately, I was good at ignoring things by pushing them to the back of my mind. By noon it was all but forgotten. The silence was strong, only broken by the occasional cry of a bird or the gentle rustle of leaves as a squirrel hopped by. It was a deep sort of silence that only the white noise of the breeze blowing through the trees could achieve. That's why I hiked. I could let it all go, focus on nothing but my footsteps, my breathing, the quiet murmur of the river. I stopped for a granola bar at what was probably an hour past last time I looked. I wasn't concerned with time at the time, so I can't say for sure. I sat on a rock a little off the path. It overlooked a small pond, where the water pooled before spilling down along the river. It was then, amidst the bubbling of the brook and the crinkling of my wrapper, that I first heard it. It made me pause. I think I stopped mid-chew. It didn't fit in at all with the forest sounds I was accustomed to. It was wrong. It took a couple seconds before it registered as words, sounding as if they were being said through auto-tune or Google Translate, like there was a filter of hesitation or misunderstanding. Rome. Way. This. Let's. That. Garbled. Inconsistent. Like catching every other word of a sentence without the proper pause or context needed for the missing words. Look. Trail. Way. I was frozen, completely and utterly. I stopped breathing. The footsteps came next, with no pace or rhythm to them. I was reminded of my 11th birthday, when we went horseback riding. It wasn't a clip-clop, but it was close. Close enough that my mind conjured up images of the Jersey Devil stamping its way through the woods, though the Pine Barrens are about 100 miles south. A breeze blew by, and with it came the stench. Rotting meat, like when I'd found that dead cat under our back porch, maggots writhing as they gorged on the dead flesh. I gagged and had to clamp a hand over my mouth to stop from retching. My eyes watered, mostly from the smell, but maybe a tiny bit because fear had taken hold of me. My heart beat like a drum in my chest as those footsteps got closer and closer. I pressed myself to the tree blocking me from sight of the path. It felt like an eternity before it was passing behind me. I could hear its wheezing breath, deep and labored, as it lumbered down the trail. And then it was gone around a bend, crooning something about, look, leaves, trail. I sat on that rock, not daring to move, for minutes after. I was at war inside my mind, trying desperately to convince myself that I'd imagined it, or that it wasn't what it seemed. Maybe it was a confused old man lost in the woods. Maybe a dying deer was downstream somewhere. That explained the smell. But I pushed it to the back of my mind, shaking my head. If I don't think about it, then it doesn't worry me. I pushed myself to my feet, swaying slightly. I looked at the half-eaten bar in my hands, my stomach rolling at the thought of food. I threw the bar in the river and shoved the wrapper in my backpack. I drank half a water bottle, suddenly desperate for that cleansing cold on my palate. I contemplated leaving, but I didn't. I certainly didn't want to continue after it, but to go back now would mean walking during dusk. I wouldn't be back to my car before dark. If there's one thing I was always told, it's that there is never a good enough reason to be walking through the woods at night. The predators came out at night. I cautiously got back on track, keeping my pace slow so as not to catch up to nothing. Because there was nothing there, right? I walked for another hour or two, hyper-aware now of every sound and movement. At one point I thought I heard more words behind me. There was also a faint smell, not one of decay, but still like something I'd smelt before. I kept on moving. The spot I was looking for was only a little further, and I found myself hurrying despite my fear, ready to set up camp and hide myself away for the night. It seemed like the sun was setting before I knew it. By then, I had made it into the clearing I generally used as camp, which I'd finished setting up in no time. Where I was off the trail quite a bit. It required a fair amount of effort getting to, being as it was through the thicket of non-trail, but I felt oddly safer, tucked into an innocuous part of the forest I was sure only I knew about. I'd stumbled upon it by accident a couple years ago, after getting briefly lost. I contemplated setting a fire like I usually would, which is probably frowned upon, I know, but I felt like it would draw too much attention. That feeling of being watching, like tiny pin pricks along my skin, had started up again. I forced myself to breathe as I sat in front of my tent and choked down a peanut butter sandwich for dinner. The full darkness of night soon prevailed. The stars shone brightly through the trees, and I laid down on a blanket to watch them for a while. It was then, as I managed to find a small semblance of peace, that a twig cracked in the distance. I frowned and sat up, peering into the darkness around me, though I couldn't see past where the clearing ended. I was just reaching for my flashlight when the wind blew again, my hair lifting with it. And there was that sickly sweet smell of decay. Panic started to set it. I hurriedly moved into my tent, zipping it up securely. I hugged my knees to my chest and listened, squeezing my eyes shut as the noises grew more frequent. Another broken branch, shuffling of leaves, ragged breathing. I found myself shaking my head, thinking that this couldn't be happening. Not now. Not to me. Look. Trail. The voice was just as grating as before. Wait. Dark. It grew closer. I could hear the moment it stepped into the clearing, the sound of brush giving way to the whispering of grass. My mind was going 100 miles an hour, trying to piece things together. The smell, the limited words, the clop-clop of cloven feet. It hit me suddenly what it was. What it had to be. Goatman. I'd read about him plenty of times on No Sleep. I'd laughed those stories off. I certainly wasn't laughing now. As Goatman shuffled closer to my tent, he began circling it. There. Dark. Wait, he repeated, pausing his steps every now and then. I was praying he'd go away. Maybe he didn't know I was in here. Maybe he'd get bored. Dark. Ambush. Tent. What? Where had he heard that? Because that's what this was, right? He only had words he'd heard before. Who on this trail had said that? My panic continued to rise, though I didn't dare make a move. Twigs snapped suddenly, somewhere in the direction of the trail. My head snapped to it involuntarily, and I had a sickening image of Goatman doing the same thing, listening for more words. The footsteps that grew closer sounded like they were being made by something. Someone, desperately trying to keep quiet but failing. Why do you need camo for fishing? I thought again, this time just a bit hysterically. Goatman happened to have stopped on the opposite side of the tent, which favored him by allowing him to remain unseen. Not that it wasn't almost pitch dark out there, save for the moon and stars. Goatman lingered for a second, my attention snapping between him and the bumbling from the other direction, before he ambled away into the night. There was a second where I stayed perfectly frozen before that survival instinct I mentioned finally kicked in. I scrambled to grab my wallet from my backpack, then shoved it in a pant pocket. Keys, check. Phone, check. Flashlight. It'll give me away if I use it, but it's heavy duty. Good for swinging. Check. Shoes tied. Check. Deep breath. I paused to inhale deeply. Check. I put my hand on the zipper and stopped to listen. They were probably just about at the edge of the trees. The opening of the tent wasn't facing towards them, but it wasn't facing away either. But Goatman had gone that way, so that was a no-go anyway. The steps stopped, and I knew they must be looking right at me. I took a second to decide how to approach my escape. I'd already decided that my tent belonged to the woods now, and my backpack would only slow me down. Do I hurtle out and book it? Or do I casually get out and then run? I placed my hand on the zipper. It was now or never. The sound of the zip seemed as loud as a gunshot. I slowly climbed out, making sure not to appear aware of the eyes on me. I gave a slow stretch, eyes steady ahead. I took a breath and pushed down all my fear and panic. Then I broke into a dead sprint. I heard one of the men shout, but I didn't hesitate as I ran towards the forest. The plan was to run straight and then cut right to get back onto the trail. I knew if I got on the trail that I could outrun them. I could hide if I needed once I was far enough away. They thundered after me, cursing loudly. I hit the layers of trees with a stumble, but my momentum kept me going. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, the trees' black lines cutting through the gray. My arms got scratched as branches whipped past. I wanted to turn my head to see if they were close. I could make out the sound of their steps over mine. I wanted to see if I could make out any sign of the trail I was running parallel to, but I didn't dare do so, for fear of tripping horror movie style. I fell anyway. 1 second I was upright, and the next I was falling, landing hard on my shoulder. My flashlight was lost to the dark forest floor. Dirt covered my hands as I scrambled to get to my feet again. I was too late. A hand closed around the back of my shirt, yanking me harshly back. A scream almost tore itself from my throat, but then a hand was over my mouth, another one winding around my waist. I thrashed and tried to kick out, digging my hands into his arm around me. He held steady, laughing between pants. Shoulda known you were a runner. His hand slid lower over my hip despite my efforts. Tears filled my eyes and spilled down my cheeks like traitors. His buddy showed up behind us, slowing his gait to a light jog. He was breathing far heavier than the one holding me. Bitch is fast, ain't she? You know I love when they fight, though. The hand over my mouth loosened for a second as his other one moved to the button of my pants. Blind panic shot through me, and I bit down as hard as I could. Warm copper filling my mouth. Fucking whore, he yowled, grip going slack. I threw my entire weight forward, once again sent sprawling. The next seconds were a blur of hands grabbing at me, rocks digging into my hands as I struggled to get traction. I was sure for a moment that this was it. I was done for. I had thought Goatman would be my end. Not this, not like this. My hands touched metal just as my ankle was grabbed. I didn't hesitate, used the grip on me as leverage to twist around and swing. There was a crack as the flashlight connected with bone. The hand released me. The man it was attached to was yelling. I swung blindly once more, striking something soft this time. The hands reaching for me were gone. I no longer tried to run forward. Instead, I focused on getting to the path, cutting into the woods at a 90-degree angle. I was on all fours for a couple feet before I was finally vertical. My heart was pounding harder than ever. Tears and snot were running down my face. The taste of blood stained my tongue. I was more or less staggering through the brush, breathing heavily. Hide. My brain was yelling, hide, hide. You're making too much noise. So I hid. I made out a patch of ferns in the dark, dropped to my knees and crawled into it. I pressed my back to a tree, facing the trail. They wouldn't see me. I tried to calm my breathing but couldn't stop the way it hitched on sobs. I could hear them once again trudging toward me, slowly this time. They were whispering harshly back and forth. You think she made it back on Dash? SHHHH. You talkin' ain't gon' help us. SHHHH. Goatman gurgled from next to me. I had to clap a hand over my mouth to stop from screaming. I slammed my eyes shut, trying to stop from sobbing. Shoo. He sounded pleased with this new word. He was crouched next to me. I could tell, could feel his rotten breath on my face, could only imagine what he looked like next to me. Cloven feet and sideways pupils, focused on me, watching, listening. Rough fingers were run gently over my hair, trailing over the side of my face. There was a moment where I was nothing but the personification of Frozen. Runner. Fast. SHHHH. Did you hear that? Close. The men were close. What was a worse way to die? By their hands or Goatman's? Sounded like talking. Talking. Goatman mused next to me. Ambush. And then he was gone once more, heading back towards my tent. His steps weren't light, branches crunching under his feet as he went. Listen, that way. Going back toward her tent? Must be. Come on, she may have a phone. And after Goatman they went. I sat there, dumbfounded that I was still alive. I sat there, breathing, amazed that I still was. Then I got shakily to my feet, making my way to the trail as quietly as possible. The relief that washed over me when the sound of the stream reached me was bittersweet. I had miles to go before I was out of the woods, both figuratively and literally. I started running when my feet reached the beaten-down soil of the path. I didn't stop when the screaming started. I certainly didn't look back when it started to echo. I didn't stop till I hit the trailhead, dawn just beginning to bleed light through the canopy of trees. My feet ached, cramps had me clutching my sides. My muscles were screaming. I paused only to throw up, dry heaving long after my stomach was emptied. There was a brief, sinking moment of terror when I saw my car and their truck in the parking lot. The thought that they'd done something to it suddenly hitting me. They evidently didn't think I'd be making it out alive, as my car started fine. My hands were shaking as they gripped the wheel. They were shaking the whole drive home and long after I'd made it there. I locked all my doors, pulled all the blinds, closed all the curtains. I showered and sobbed and brushed my teeth till my gums were red. I chased a sleeping pill with a bottle of water, then took another just for good measure. I slept and thankfully didn't dream. I wrote this all just now, after waking up. This is just as much a warning as it's a way to get it off my mind, so I can hopefully push it all down. I finish with this. If you ever find yourself alone in the woods with monsters, pray that there's something worse out there. It may be the only way you survive. And if that something worse happens to be Goatman, don't you dare say a word. Because if you have, then I'm afraid it may be too late.